Venezuela has seen itself shaken by political and civil instability in the past few weeks. Protests have turned deadly in Caracas as demonstrators take to the streets to demand the resignation of President Nicolas Maduro. Joining us now from our nation's capital to tell us what's behind the revolt, Jean Daudelin. He is professor at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. And Professor Daudelin, it's good to have you on the line from Ottawa for us. As we take a look at a map of Venezuela, just to situate it in Latin America for our viewers, give us your sense of the latest on the state of the protests right now.
Well, I don't know what happened today, but yesterday 2 more people were killed, 1 protester and 1 government security or policeman. And demonstrations are likely to continue, not just in Caracas, but all over the country on a more or less large scale with repression. And I think the population will continue to ask for the liberation. The demonstrators will continue to ask for the liberation of the students who were arrested, and especially of Leopoldo Lopez, the opposition leader who was jailed after the first few days of demonstrations.
We're going to show some pictures of those demonstrations now, and as we do, perhaps you could tell us how this crisis started to begin with.
Well, there are various reasons why people started demonstration, but the real origin is really a massive discontent with the situation of the country, with the violence, with the economic crises, the blackouts, and it started among the opposition, especially among students. And after the first demonstration degenerated, at the end, a few demonstrators were killed, and new demonstrations. Started asking for the liberation of those and challenging the government. That's when Leopoldo Lopez got involved, and in a way, he gave it more of a shape, and started to suggest that it should ask for the resignation of President Nicolas Maduro.
The president says that the protesters are right-wing fascists backed by the United States attempting to launch a coup against him. Do you think there's anything to that?
I think that the United States would prefer to have another regime in Venezuela, but I don't see much indication that they are behind those protests. As to the fascism, I think this is strictly rhetoric. And finally, as to the ability of the current opposition to stage a coup, I think this is perfectly ridiculous. The opposition is essentially disarmed. The only thing it has is a certain capacity of mobilization.
Who are the opposition?
Well, there's all this. People often describe them strictly as upper and middle class people, but you have to remember that a year ago there were elections after the death of Hugo Chávez, and almost 50% of the population voted for the opposition candidate. And Venezuela doesn't have 50% of its population in the middle and upper classes. So there's quite a broad base. There's quite a broad base of people who are unhappy with the government. Now, it's quite clear that the middle class and the elites are basically, as a bloc, opposed to the government. They've been voting for the opposition. They've been financing the opposition for a very long time. But it's not just them, and there are very good reasons for a large number of people to be unhappy with the current situation in Venezuela.
Chávez, though, has been dead for almost exactly a year. Do you wonder why it's taken so long for this discontent to foment?
Well, I think it was bubbling. It was bubbling up a bit. One of the key things is that the opposition, which had historically extreme difficulty in uniting, I mean, they were able to unite against Maduro in the last election about a year ago, is redividing again. See, Leopoldo López had decided that he would leave the leadership, and I mean, he would let Enrique Capriles be the candidate of the opposition. So I mean, he let him basically lead the opposition, and I think that after a while he got a bit tired. Now, in a general, so that's why he got engaged, and that's why he started to basically try to lead a movement. And I mean, his position is he's much less open to negotiations and discussions, and is asking for the resignation of the president is a bit maximalist. It's extremely unlikely to happen, and by doing that, I mean, he's kind of cutting off the possibility of dialogue. Meanwhile, the Capriles is trying to surf the wave, but he doesn't quite control it. And another factor, one thing that matters, is that as the situation is very volatile because of the difficult economic conditions, about which I hope you'll want to talk a bit later, and because of the violence, any little event can lead to a demonstration. There were events in the western part of the country about rape by partisans of the government. I mean, the story is not very clear, but it's the kind of spark that can lead to widespread mobilization.
Well, let's introduce some of those facts on the ground, particularly as they relate to the economy, as you just suggested. This is from a piece in The Guardian last month. This tropical would-be alternative to capitalism is a husk. It faces an existential threat, not from youths chanting in plazas, but from the fact that Venezuela is a shambolic, crumbling, dysfunctional ruin. The official inflation rate, 56%, is among the world's highest. There are shortages of bread, flour, meat, toilet paper, and other basics. Airlines are threatening to cut services because the government owes them $3.3 billion. Food companies are owed $2.4 billion. Bond prices have plunged to levels associated with default. Recession hovers. Crime is out of control. The government has stopped publishing regular statistics, but non-governmental organization estimates the murder rate at 25,000 annually, one of the world's highest per capita rates, deadlier than Iraq. Kidnappings. People are snatched for ransom from bus stops, universities, shopping malls, airports, compound public anxiety. An estimated 97% of murders go unpunished. The list goes on. A catalog of neglect and decay. Venezuela is unraveling. One of the other statistics we learn is that a person is murdered in Venezuela every 21 minutes. Professor Daudelin, this country is rich with oil, has the world's largest oil reserves, known reserves. It had all the makings of a success story. What went wrong?
Well, the first thing to say is that it started unraveling a while back. And one cannot put all the responsibility for the current situation on Hugo Chávez and his revolutionary regime. For decades before that, the country had been mismanaged. There was corruption, and the basically oil revenues had been used, let's say, not really to benefit a large portion of the population, and the economic performance of the country was already not very good. What Chávez did was use the fast rising oil prices to change the beneficiaries. And he channeled lots of the resources that were generated towards the poor through a number of social programs, education, and so on. That's how he built his social base. But his qualities as an economic manager and the quality of his team were dreadful. And now, after 15 years of politicized recruitment and promotion into public service, after 15 years of slow trickling out of technocrats, economists, and intellectuals, the ability of the state to manage the growing challenges is ridiculously limited while these challenges are increasing.
Many people will remember when Chávez called President Barack Obama the devil. And I wonder whether you think, in hindsight, it would have made more sense for him to be less bellicose as it relates to the United States. Would that have been better for Venezuela?
I don't think that the attitude of Chávez towards the United States has had much of an impact. I think it's much more his economic policies and basically the mismanagement of the economy that has produced the current crisis, much more than anything having to do with the U.S. I mean, I think it was a sideshow. It was a way for Chávez to drum up support among the population, among nationalists. But it had basically no bearing. It's very difficult to imagine the U.S. doing something that could have resolved the problems that Venezuela was confronting.
Well, let me ask you about President Maduro, who was, I guess, groomed by Chávez to take over from him. How would you characterize the kind of leadership he has provided to Venezuela at this time? Well,
Hugo Chávez was an extraordinary man with amazing political characteristics. He had the common touch. He was a very effective speaker. He was beloved by his followers. By that standards, and even by much more pedestrian standards, Nicolas Maduro doesn't bring much to the table. The man has no charisma, no particular technical capabilities, and his rise through the ranks was mostly due to his political fidelity to the leader. So he's overwhelmed by what's happening now and basically trying to survive. So if you follow him on a day-to-day basis, I mean, his declarations will be often inconsistent, and he doesn't seem to be very clear about what the next steps can be. So not much of a leader.
It must have been apparent to Chávez that he wasn't going to be as strong a leader as Chávez was. So why did he pick him to be his successor?
I think he was, well, I mean, what did Chávez think? I think the more natural, more capable one could have been the current president of the National Assembly, Diosdado Cabello. But Chávez, I felt a bit more threatened by him. That is, it was very clear that the only thing that Maduro would do would be to save the legacy of Hugo Chávez. I mean, the man himself has no personal project. So this is the most likely reason, not the very good one, but this is, in my view, the most likely reason why he was chosen.
Now, you've been all over Latin America, so I want to sort of pick your brains for a moment on how what's happening in Venezuela has an impact on what goes on throughout all of South America and Latin America, in fact. So tell us this, how important is a stable Venezuela to what happens in the rest of the southern part of our hemisphere?
Okay, it depends for whom. I mean, it matters the most, I would say, for the countries that are getting subsidized oil from Venezuela. The most important of them is Cuba. But Haiti is getting some, and a number of small Caribbean countries are getting some too. And we're talking of transfers that represent billions of dollars on which those economies have come to depend. And clearly, continuing instability and the economic crisis in Venezuela will likely lead to the suspension of those subsidies. So for Cuba, for instance, this is likely to be disastrous. So through that, a certain degree of instability in countries that are relatively fragile, refugee flows, perhaps a degree of political instability, mostly in the Caribbean, also in Central America. Nicaragua is getting subsidized oil too. but mostly concentrated in the Caribbean basin. For neighboring countries, Brazil and Colombia are immediate neighbor. Colombia historically has a complicated and, in fact, quite a conflictual relationship with Chavez, with Venezuela under Chavez, and but at the same time, I mean, they are relatively insulated. They don't trade that much with Venezuela, and their economy, by contrast, is very well managed and very stable. As for Brazil cannot be affected directly by Venezuela, but what is at stake to some extent is Brazil's claim to be a leader of the region, to be the great manager and the great conflict resolver, a role it has played extremely well over the last 10 years under President Lula. And the current president of Dilma Rousseff doesn't seem to be interested in playing that role, which I would say is bad for everybody, because Brazil has lots of legitimacy in the region, and right now they seem more intent on taking the side of the Venezuelan government instead of trying to float a bit above the fray and come down to calm the spirits.
But if I hear you right, you're saying that because of what's going to happen with oil, the price of oil, and the shock to some of the neighboring economies, we could have significant government instability in some of these neighboring countries. Is that right?
I think so, or at least, I mean, these countries will have to find substitutes, perhaps through aid from other countries, especially North American countries, the U.S. and Canada. And many of those countries have significant vulnerabilities in the Caribbean. Many are very violent too. Many are very susceptible to corruption simply because they are small. There are problems with drug trafficking. So yes, there could be consequences. The biggest one, the most important one, is Cuba. And with Cuba, it's a more complicated story because Cuba has had a very close relationship with Chavez, Venezuela, and Cubans. In fact, doctors and various technicians, but especially intelligence and security specialists from Cuba, are currently in Venezuela and working quite closely with Maduro. Sorry?
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, can you imagine the Castro brothers falling, that government falling as a result of what's transpiring in Venezuela?
I can't see that happening because they've been through economic disasters. They have an extremely good grip on the military and the security forces, and they will be able to impose their will on the Cuban people. But it will be a major challenge for them.
Do you see, Professor Daudelin, these protests continuing in Venezuela for a long time?
Yes, I do. In fact, I see the situations deteriorating further because if the government wants to tackle the problems of inflation, if it wants to introduce a more rational economic policy to avoid the shortages, in the short and medium term, this is likely to be very costly, and most of that cost will be borne by poor people. So that the discontent that's heavily concentrated, but not exclusively, among the middle and the upper classes is likely to contaminate the current Chavista social base. And these people will have no voice. So I see a situation in which much more chaotic possibly developing, I mean, on top of the already extremely, the chaos that already exists. And contrary to Cuba, the government doesn't have a really good grip over the various military and gang and militias that roam the country. So the situation, I'd be very surprised if the situation doesn't deteriorate much further.
Professor Jean Daudelin from Carleton University at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. It's good of you to join us on TVO tonight and help us out with this increasingly complicated problem in Latin America. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.